Welcome back to the Life Recreated show. I am super excited for this conversation that we're going to be having today. I have a good friend with me, Jessica Walrath, here on the show. We're going to have a candid conversation. Welcome to the show, Jessica. How you doing?
Good. Thanks, Nick. Thanks for having me
Good.
on.
I was really excited about having this conversation, like I was mentioning to you, just trying to get a better understanding and just to highlight some of the things that we can see happening in the church. On this channel, I've talked about different things, my own experience. And on this segment, I wanted to really dive in with you on the observations you've had of being a woman in the church, what you've experienced, some of the things that you've seen and have happened to you over that time in the church. I'm really curious to dive into it. So let me start here. When did you first get into the church and join the church?
So when I was a teenager, I started going to like youth groups and stuff with my family. My aunt would take me. And so that was my first church experience was as a youth growing up in a church. And it was a Spanish Pentecostal church. And, it was where I really started believing and seeking God. And as a teenager, I knew that he was there. Like he would always make himself known to me even when I wasn't seeking him. So I knew about God pretty early on, but I didn't really start, I guess, serving God until I was in my early to mid 20s. That's when the my husband and I entered into the abusive church and had an abusive church experience. Now, what I didn't know was I spoke to one of my uncles when we were leaving the church. Actually, I didn't realize how common it is to that people have come from abusive backgrounds like that, abusive church background. So my uncle had gone through a very similar experience with a church in New York, and my mother and my father, they've all experienced similar things. And I didn't realize that how prevalent it was out there until I started sharing my story with my family. So learning about what everybody else gone through and how they had really recovered or are still recovering from that kind of really helped my husband and I both to move forward and start seeking God for ourselves.
I think what was interesting that you just said, as you mentioned, you said you didn't realize how prevalent it was until you started sharing your story and starting to hear it and understand it. So to backtrack, like when you were growing up as a teen, who was it that was bringing you to church at the time? Were you just going on your own?
So I come from a really family.
Okay.
So we were all living together. So I had my aunt, my uncle, my three cousins, my abuela, abuelo, my father, my sister, and I all lived in the same house. So it was my titi that actually started taking me, my aunt. She started taking me to church with her. She was the youth leader. And that's really where I had my first like real experience with Jesus.
You said that your aunt was a youth leader as far as like helping with all the youth and everything like that. Was that so did she play besides being a youth leader, did she play like some other different roles like in leadership or was she pretty active in the church?
She was very active in the church and she was a spiritual mother to me in a lot of ways. And she was very highly respected in the church. And ministry was very common for women. Even pastorship in the church was common. So it was very different for me to when we had entered into an abusive church and how they manipulated the scriptures to make it fit what they wanted to suppress the women leadership.
That ties into exactly what I was just thinking because seeing your aunt and seeing how active and how involved she was in the church, I can imagine growing up and continuing your relationship with God, it should come natural to you to be involved in ministry and just to be active within the church as a woman and kind of have that right to be able to do that.
That's right.
Um,
Yeah, that's absolutely
as far as knowing that that's your background and seeing that and seeing how a woman would be able to function really well in that position, how did you feel like when you entered that church in the abusive church in that situation? What were your feelings when you initially entered and you probably didn't see the same thing? Or did you observe the same thing when you first entered that
So
church?
I think with the key with a lot of the abusive churches is they're not very upfront with exactly what they believe at first. It's you get attached to the people, you get attached to the church and to the, into different aspects. And then gradually you start seeing that there are more rules and more rules and more rules that they're adding on. And then you get to the point where you see some things, and then you're like, okay, well, they don't believe in this, but I can still believe in this, or they don't believe that you can do this, but I think that I still believe that you should be able to do this. And I think for me, one of the biggest things was when I had actually talked about starting a ministry. And it wasn't like a full on ministry, it was for women, and it was for reading books and reviewing books together. And it was looked at like, hey, what are you doing? You are not supposed to be doing this. You can't be leading other women in this way. I don't care if it's in a godly way. I don't care if you're still promoting God or reading biblically based books. It doesn't matter. You're not supposed to do it. So that to me was really confusing, because I was like, wait, we do this anyway. We do this when we're fellowshipping, we do this when we're talking with each other anyway. So what difference does it make if I set a specific date and time to do it rather than us just having a conversation and doing it? When it came to that and the reaction that I got from it, that was really what was telling. I was like, wow, like almost like I was being looked at like an enemy of sorts. And that's not where it was like, oh, so you're trying to do something on your own without asking anybody? Did God tell you to do this? And I'm like, yeah, so I have to. Are you hearing from God, from me? I don't understand where this was going. I didn't understand it. So it was really confusing. But then when my husband, after speaking with him, he was like, they're thinking that you're just trying to start something. You're trying to start your own thing and influence people in a different way. And I'm like, okay, I can see why. I guess that is what they're thinking. It still didn't make sense. So, but gradually over time, after seeing so many things, there comes a point when you're like, okay, this is too many red flags now. So it's time to go.
I appreciate you sharing that. I think that's important to share. And one of the things so do you feel like with that story that you just mentioned, do you feel like for you that was a light, like I always call it like a light bulb moment where I'm just
Yeah.
like, hey, wait a
Yeah.
second, something's not right. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it was a light bulb moment, but it also made me realize that I'm not a sister in the church. I am a potential Jezebel. I'm always looked at potentially, I'm trying to revolt or rise up against somebody else. Like, this isn't your job. So that was kind of eye opening to me, because I would never assume that in somebody, but apparently that is the assumption always when it comes to women in a church like that. It always goes back to having a Jezebel spirit, or I think that was kind of different for me.
So when you say Jezebel spirit, what do you think that I guess I like to try and tie this kind of question together. What do you think that in your personality that and like we even talked about your background, like what you experienced growing up in the church and experienced with seeing women in leadership, but what do you think it was in maybe in your personality that was causing them to try and label you as that? Because it's a word that you hear talked around. It's like, oh, you get the Jezebel spirit, but then it's like, okay, well, give me what is it like that's causing you to think this so that we can explain like, hey, I'm not really trying to be like that. If you would know my background and like know where I come from and know what I seen growing up, then you would know why I act like this, you know, how I am. What do you think it was in you and your personality that may kind of cause that?
Honestly, I don't have any specific like personality trait that I would say caused that to stand out. I think just having an opinion that differs from headship is what's going to make you stand out against, and having your own opinions and being independent thinker is what's going to make you stand out in a place that's looking for conformity rather than unity. Because unity doesn't mean that you have to all think the same and do the same. But I think that is what the biggest difference is. If you have something that's a different, if you have any opinion that is your own and is different from headship, then you're always going to be looked at like a potential Jezebel or have a rebellious spirit of some sort, at least in the experiences that I have seen or that I have had. I say
Go
that
ahead.
because I don't particularly think that there's anything special about like the way that I was or the way that I am in my personality or the way I speak or how I serve God. I don't think there's anything unique or special about that. But I think that the fact that I wanted to try something that somebody else didn't want to try or that has never been done before or had questioned somebody else's authority, it almost makes it seem like, oh, okay, well, you don't want to conform. So that means that you are trying to be an agitator of some sort and do your own thing. So it kind of makes you, it kind of puts a flag on you, like a red flag, like, oh, where's this going?
Now, with that, did you see a difference between how men and women were treated when it came to that?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
How so? So there's two parts of it. If you can, and you can think about just maybe sharing an example or a situation you've seen, that'd be great. And then number two, I'm really curious, like, how did that make you feel, like seeing that? What did that do internally to you as far as how you're looking at leadership and how you're looking at what the whole environment is?
Trying to think back, there was definitely double standard when it came to men and women within the church. Men could begin ministries without really any precedent or anything because their premise was trying to do this to disciple people or to help in some way. For example, somebody had started a ministry for men, had absolutely no oversight over it. Honestly, I saw a lot of men being in positions that they shouldn't have been, where
Ooh,
women were
okay.
actually a lot more talented in those areas and they weren't able to utilize the gifts and the talents that had been given them because they carried a Y chromosome. It just
Mm,
made no sense to me because there were women who were completely born for this. Like they're born for doing things. They're born gifted speakers, gifted, musicians that could not take the positions that they really should have had because of the double standard between men and women. Women should not have been in that position because they could have possibly been over men in that area. And it just made no sense because you would see the women pulling the string. You would see the women behind the curtain being the church, and the men were there as just a figurehead. Literally, that's what it seemed like because the men would just be there as the faces, but behind the scenes, the women were the ones that were actually doing the work. They were the ones who were actually making things happen, and they weren't respected in that way.
and I can attest to what you're saying as far as like being in leadership in that position and seeing what you're saying as far as a lot of things being done behind the background. I remember a lot of times where if I needed help with something, and it's sometimes it's sad to say it, but I know there's a lot of times where I would trust and know that this sister would get this done over this guy because
Yeah.
I would just know I'd have to keep going back and going back. And so you're right. I think there's a lot of things that happen behind the scene. How did that make you feel when you saw that?
Honestly, it's not until after the fact because when you're just trying to serve, you're just trying to serve. You're not worried about, you're not doing this to get glory. You're not in church so that somebody can recognize you and see you and point you out and call you out and say, oh, she's anointed by God. That's not the reason why you're there. You're there because you're trying to look for God and you're trying to seek God in every way. And you'll see God no matter where. If you're looking for him, you're going to find him. So when it comes to the church and seeing all these things, a lot of it I didn't see until we left. It wasn't until that we were gone that it started coming together. It started piecing together. And I'm like, you know what? This was what was going on. This was what was really happening at that time. And I didn't really realize it until sometimes you get too close to things that you can't see the big picture. And when you walk
Mm.
away is when things start coming into clarity. You know what? I just realized that this has been going on for a really long time. I just never noticed it. Had I been looking for it before, I would have seen it all day. But it wasn't something that I was looking for. I was just looking to serve God. I was just looking to be there for God. And it's not until you leave and start bringing, God starts bringing clarity to you. I think it's more of a defensive thing too sometimes because it protects you from being hurt in that moment. I think God was really guarding my mind and heart in a lot of ways because had I felt that rejection in that way at that moment, that would have been really painful for me. But looking back on it, I realized that was really God's grace that was covering my mind and covering my heart. But as I move forward with my life and start healing, God starts revealing, you've seen this before. This has happened in this way and in this way. And you just never noticed it because I was there for you and I covered you.
Wow, that's awesome how you just explained all of that because I do feel like what you just said does happen because like as you said, once you leave, it's almost kind of like a trickling down. Like in your mind, you just start connecting and you're like, oh, I see this and how that happened, and you start connecting all those dots. But if God were to reveal all of that to you in that moment, it would
Yeah.
have been,
Shattering.
I don't, yeah, it totally, on one of the other interviews, we were talking about your value and your self worth.
Yeah.
And to think if God were to had not kind of sheltered you and sheltered a lot of us during that time, it would have been damaging. It would have
Yeah.
been really damaging. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Absolutely.
I loved how you put that into words. I think that was good. I think that was good. Now, while you were there, you're transitioning out. I always like to ask this question. When you had that first moment where you noticed what was going on, maybe the first aha moment, what was the time frame like between that moment and the time that you finally said, you know what, I've had enough, and you walked away? Do you
It was
remember
still
what
a
the
long
time was like?
time. It was still
Okay.
a long time. It still took years, I think, after that.
Yeah.
After the initial, like, wow, I'm really not respected. This is wrong. I think that this is a wrong thing that's happening. From that moment to when we left, I think it was still maybe like 2, 3 years, maybe two and a
Mm,
half years, something like that, which
wow.
actually says a lot about staying in a place where you're comfortable and how integral relationships are. When you're in a
Yeah.
place like that, they create it so that it makes it almost that much more difficult, because the relationships are what really winds up keeping you as long as it does. Then when you leave, that's your biggest fear, is I'm going to lose all these relationships. And then you realize it's for the best. But still, it takes a long time. I think it takes a lot of wearing down. I think it's almost like a beating down of your spirit, and God revealing things in its time, and then trying to take that and move forward with it as best as you can.
That is true. It does take time. It definitely takes time. So besides that, now leaving and moving on, what challenges as a woman have you felt that you've faced now readjusting? Because once you leave that type of environment, you really, because how long were you all in the church for total? 10 years or something, right?
No, I think
No.
for us, it was like 6 years.
6 years? A long time, but that's
Still a
still a
long
long
time,
time.
but it's still a lot
That's
less
still
than
a
a
long
lot of
time.
other people. And, the truth was, I was really grateful to have a family that has that history too, so they can help
Yeah.
us walk through it together. And they're like, hey, we've been through this. I'm sorry you're having to go through this, but we know that this can be really damaging, but God. So it was really good for us when we finally did step out, but it does have its lasting effects. Afterwards, I hadn't worked that entire time that we were in that church. I'd never worked, and I was really scared to step out. My husband was really scared because the way that they would portray women in the workplace was like, oh, you're pimping your wife out, or there's these women and they have no morals because they're out there working and they should be home with their children. You're battling against this in your own mind. Hey, are my kids going to be okay if I go to work? Is my family still going to be okay if I step out and do this? Should I even be doing this? So there's and I think that's a lot of that is normal, but I think it's amplified because you're coming from a place where it was so negative. It was always looked at as a negative thing. So trying to combat that as you move forward too, that is a hurdle. It's a hurdle that you really have to go through, but it's also a way of you to build yourself back up and realize that this entire time God has been with you and he doesn't care. He is genuinely for you no matter what you do.
What would you say to somebody as far as, because that's where you're at in this season right now, as far as just working through that? What would you say to encourage somebody that maybe is beginning to go into that season? Because it's a difficult transition where you're going from this one mindset that's been drilled into your head and then reinforced by the whole entire environment. It's spoken to you across the pulpit through words, sometimes maybe not through words, and then it's just reinforced by the environment. So then you get out of it. And I guess my thing would be, what do you find helped you to be able to manage that and try and overcome that so you could achieve things that you desired?
Honestly, I still struggle with that. Like, I
Mhm.
still struggle daily with feeling confident in what I do and how I do it. But that's kind of why I have the partner I have in life. My husband helps me, supports me, he encourages me when I need it. And he's like, you have done this. You are worthy. You are this. You are that. It's good to have support. And that is the biggest thing. Like, when you're leaving a church that has been abusive in this way, to have as much support from your family as you can, from family members, people who have been there, trying to find a support system that can really help you and relate to what you're going through and navigate that path with you. We found a good church that was really about healing after church hurt, and that was really instrumental in where we are now. I
Right.
think that would probably be my biggest advice. That, plus I would tell people when they were leaving the church, like, just read through Psalms for a little bit, because it's gonna hurt.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
gonna be so
right.
relatable.
Yeah, yeah, you're like, oh, that's what they were talking about. This whole time we're
This
like
whole
singing
time.
songs about it. And then you go through it, you're like, oh man, I see where this guy was in a cave. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? That's good advice. That's really good advice. And I'm sure that helps to know that. One thing I was just thinking about as you were mentioning that with having family, did your family that you mentioned before, did they see some of the signs or see what was
As
happening
a
and say
matter of
anything to you?
they really did. So I had my uncle come to the church. He came, he met with the pastor, he listened to the sermon, and he had his concerns. But I think when it comes down to it, it's very much the same as domestic abuse, where until you see it, nobody's going to be able to show you. And I think he
Ooh.
was waiting for us. Like he was there, arms open, like he knew what was going on. He knew how to help us afterwards. But it's very much one of those things like, hey, if you talk to somebody and they're in that and they can't see it, then you're pretty much talking to a wall, you know?
When you really think about it, we were at a point so brainwashed to where it was like nothing mattered. I was reading something the other day too, and it was saying it was the topic was it was talking about spiritual abuse and everything like that. And it said one of the problems that happens when you're in that environment, in that system, you're doing something for God, right? You're on fire for God. You're like, we're going out, we're witnessing, we're doing all these different things. So you're doing something for God. So that's like a win for you. And then if you go out into the world and let's say people reject you or they slam the door in your face and they're like, get out of here, we don't want to talk to you, it's still a win because you're like, we're doing this for God. So you're in this environment where you are so like nothing that anybody says outside of what is happening in there, you can't hear any of it. You don't hear
That's
any of
true.
it. You don't hear any of
Absolutely.
it.
Hundred
Wow.
percent true. Because even then you can say, oh, well, they weren't rejecting me. They were rejecting God at that time.
Exactly.
You know, you
Exactly.
can
So you
kind of
never take.
exactly. Exactly.
Oh, wow.
So
Okay.
I agree with that.
That's good. And I think too, having a family, having somebody that can support you, that understands it, I think is really key. And that's what I'm learning. I'm just learning somebody that you can find afterwards that you trust. You know, thankfully, y'all had your family that he had been through it. He understood it. He has seen it before. So in his mind, the same thing happened with me and my parents. My dad, they've been in ministry and they've been saved for a while. And they used to come and they'd be, you know, they see it, right? And they're just like, oh my God, this guy is freaking going down a rabbit hole.
Right.
But you know, once you move on, having that support system is really helpful. It helps to balance a lot of it.
Yeah.
So, as we kind of wrap up a little bit, I'm thinking about so after you've experienced what you experienced in that environment, in that church environment, what do you think are the changes that you think need to happen culturally within those type of church that can really change that? Because and what I'm gonna kind of context it because when you look at like Jesus and you look at how he was walking and how he interacted with women and how he was more about giving them back their value and giving them their appreciation rather than it being okay, hey, you're just supposed to stay quiet and you just play the background and not say anything. He was always like elevating a woman and saying, hey, look, you need to pay attention to what she did because
Hmm.
she is doing something more than just all you other guys just talking.
Hmm.
And so within the church, not just in the spiritually abusive church, but it happens a lot of times in just churches in general. What do you think needs to happen culturally to change a lot of that to where it's more of a balance?
I think because there's so many different denominations and every type of church is this one allows this and this one doesn't allow that and this one doesn't allow this. I think really bringing women into ministry and seeing these women in ministry is a very powerful tool. There are women that are out there and they could only hear from a woman. And it's the same thing with men. There's certain men out there that when they're listening for something, it can only be reached by a certain person. I think
Mhm.
recognizing talents in everybody, no matter what shape or what form it comes in, it's just recognizing that there's God working it through them and recognizing their talents and them being exalted, but acknowledging God in them. And I think that is something that in these churches that's not being done. God's not being in the forefront with them. It's like, nope, that's not God in you. That's you and you that's trying to come out. And it's not, acknowledging the God and the gift in the women and really trying to put that on the forefront rather than power and prestige or title, anything like that. Culturally, I know it's different for each denomination, but honestly, denominations themselves, I don't, the way that they have become is they keep themselves in a box by doing that. I don't think that you can fully see the true aspect of what God's trying to do in the church, even just by putting a name on what you believe and how
Well,
exactly you believe it.
I think you said something that was extremely key is learning how to acknowledge the God in them. I wrote that down because that's really what you're after. It's not it's like you mentioned, like a lot of times for women who want to express the God within them, whatever gift they have or whatever gift that God has blessed them with, they want to express that. But a lot of times in these type of environments, they don't want to acknowledge that's really God working in you, right? It's not
Right.
you trying to take over the whole church. I think it
Yeah.
comes from a lot of insecurity. You know what I mean? It comes from the insecurity of, if I let this happen, then you're gonna take over. And it's like, what are you even talking about? I was thinking about what you were talking about with the book club. I don't want to be preaching like next Sunday. You know what I mean? Like, I just want to
Yeah.
read and learn, and you need to chill out. And then also, if you really think about it, when you allow the space for you to acknowledge God in women and their gifts, as a shepherd, this is my thinking, like, as being a pastor, if I allow you to operate the way that God designed you to operate, that's going to make my job way easier. Because there's things that you're going to be able to minister to that God doesn't put as a responsibility on me. He says, all right, if Jessica is gifted in this, Nick, that's not your responsibility. Like, let her handle that,
Hmm.
and I'll continue to operate this. So it comes to a point where you realize God is way smarter at running this church than we can be if we just let him do it the way
That's
he
right.
wants to do it, for sure.
Yeah, that's right. For sure.
For sure. That's good. That's good. So, what would you give as we wrap up? Say, for instance, you're looking back, it's been probably 4 or 5 years since you've been out of that church that you experienced at. What type of advice would you give the Jessica of you 5 years ago, when you were coming out of it and you had no idea how this journey would have felt and all these things we even talked about in this conversation? What type of advice would you give the Jessica of 5 years on, this is going to be ahead of you and this is the best way for you to embrace it and to handle it, but
Yeah.
for you to grow as much? What would you say to her?
That's a good question because honestly, I think I had answered it earlier where what would I say to somebody that was going through that right now? Pretty much lean on your support system, try to find outside of the church somebody that you trust and that you acknowledge that can help you. That would be number one. But two, trust God. Trust that God is going to guide you through it. And that's exactly what he does. He surrounds you with people that you need to be around. It's not going to it doesn't mean that it's going to be easy, but it's definitely going to be worth it to understand now the freedom that you have in Christ is something that can't be told. You just experience as you do it. So really just trust in God and know that he has your best interest at heart, but really surround yourself with people who try to rebuild community around you because you're leaving your community now. So now you have to rebuild, and hopefully you can find somebody maybe in your family, maybe a trusted friend that you've put on a back burner for a while, but will always be there for you. Really leaning into those relationships and seeing what God brings out of that. That would be the biggest thing.
That's really good advice. And it's simple, it's straight to the point. Find somebody that you can lean on and just really trust in God. I think that really helps a lot of people. And I appreciate you. I'm so grateful for you being willing to come on to share this. I know it's not easy to really want to tell all this stuff, because the way that they set up those systems and the way that they set up those environments,
Yeah,
when you leave, you operate out of all this fear and all this stuff in your head. So
that's
I
right. That's
really,
right.
yeah, I appreciate you coming on. I
Yeah.
appreciate you sharing how you feel. I hope that when people see this and when they hear your story and what you've experienced, what your background was, and maybe it's similar to theirs, and they could say, wow, Jessica was able to go through that and come out on the other side of it, then maybe I can come out on the other side of it. It's really encouraging. You got anything else that you'd like to share before we head out?
I think we hit all the points. I think, I'm really grateful for this show. I think I've come back and watched a couple things back on
Yeah,
YouTube, and I appreciate the info that you bring. So thank you for that, Nick.
nice.